Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Jon Hansen. Jon is one of my oldest friends and my co-author for the book Procurement at a Crossroads. It would be hard to find anybody who has covered the procurement space more thoroughly and honestly than Jon has. So, hi, Jon. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to the Sourcing Hero podcast.
Well, you know, Kelly, it's great to be sharing these virtual airwaves with you. And by the way, why didn't they ever turn our book into a movie? I'll never understand that.
You know,
I had Brad Pitt lined up for us, for me.
I was just going to say they couldn't find two people good looking and charismatic enough to play us on the big screen.
Anyway, no, it's great to talk with you. It's hard to believe so many years have gone by since we first met, and a lot of miles, a lot of things have happened.
A lot of miles. And in fact, people may or may not know, so you're either going to get thank yous or complaints. I only ever started podcasting because you told me I had to. So you can get in touch. Jon will share at the end of the conversation how he wants to receive his complaints and compliments. But you've been a leading content creator in the procurement space before the idea of a content creator or an influencer was anything. So talk a little bit about the professional journey that brings you to this moment.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You start, and I guess I would say this. I started on the practitioner side and evolved into a provider side, built up a software company, as you know, and ultimately sold it during the .com heyday. It was one of the first algorithm-driven, web-based procurement tools for the Department of National Defense that was later picked up by the New York City Transit Authority. And then once I sold that, where do I go from here? And the starting point was the Procurement Insights blog, which somebody said, look, you're writing so many different articles for so different public, have it all in one place. Let it be a buffet. And if people want to use some of it, then let them do that. And that's how it all really started, very humbly with a blog. And you're wondering, gee, is somebody going to ever read this? And of course, then a couple of years later, when Blog Talk Radio emerged on the scene, I said, you know what? It'd be a great idea to have a radio show and interview people from our industry, from our profession, and from business, sort of extending it a little bit. Because at that point, I believe that procurement and supply chain shouldn't just operate in a silo because of the impact it has across the organization. So I started that radio show, and PI Window on Business became Window on the World. Did 900 segments there and had some great interviews. You know, you were with me for a period on a weekly basis.
I was.
We made updates, and that was fun. And that's where I knew you were going to be great on a podcast. But I'll tell you, and you just always the common focus is that to say it, call it like it is, to say it, to be honest, to take a different perspective from what everybody else was taking. I'm not talking, Kelly, about being contrary or whatever for the sake of that. What I'm really talking about is the ability to say, well, everybody has a unique view. Everybody has a perspective that's unique. I have one because I came up through this unique track more than 40 years ago. So let's talk frankly. Let's look for things that other people aren't talking about or should be talking about. And that's really how you get to this point.
Well, speaking of talking frankly, we actually picked a really interesting topic for today. We were talking about the mythical talent war. So I want you to start us off, and to your point about being compelling but not contrary, start us off with the basics. What do you mean when you refer to the talent war?
Well, I've got to go back to the motivation for this, because there's been a lot of up and coming podcasters and articles. Ian Campbell McKenna, for example, Procurement in 5 Minutes. His background is in hiring and recruiting and advising on procurement talent. And I kept hearing this term talent war coming up, and then I remembered back in 2007. I wrote an article on the talent war, and it was based on a CPO agenda roundtable, which had senior executives from Dannon and Merrill Lynch, and really some global enterprises. And they had a discussion on the future of procurement. And one of the lines that resonated out of that, and there were many great insights, one of the lines was that they all agreed, reached a consensus, that one strategic thinker was worth 10 of what they called the run-of-the-mill buyers. And this is kind of interesting because here we are, it's 2007, and we're talking about the talent war. And I tweet that. Then I remember a few years later, I wrote another article in terms of the talent war, and how people were saying, look, we need you. I think you were even involved in one discussion of this where it was, I think the title was called Buyers Need Not Apply. I don't know if you remember that. And we were looking at it and we we're saying, well, wait a second. How come so many CPOs, how come so many executives are dissatisfied with the performance or the ability of their teams? In fact, there was a series of studies that came after that, 5 consecutive years where CPOs said, the majority said, we don't believe our teams have the necessary skill sets to help us to achieve our strategic objectives. Right. And so, why is this lingering? I mean, why is this still a problem? And then I came across another report and I started to get feedback on this. And one of the interesting points is was it because the talent wasn't there, or was it because the parameters that were set up to judge performance of procurement limited it? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, it's that perspective. We're listening to all of this C-level feedback around concern, and I'd rather have one of these versus 10 of those. And we're taking for granted that they are seeing accurately the capabilities of the people that exist within procurement.
In other words, you get what you deserve. You get the parameters and the rewarding for procurement so long has seen as an adjunct to finance. It was a functional. I remember your quote in the book where you said it's where people send somebody when they don't want to be seen again. I think that was the quote. And I mean, most procurement professionals volunteered. And so you look at that, and it was basically a transactional performance of getting the best price. And so when they needed, and as the world began to evolve, and the requirements and the impact of procurement and supply chain started to evolve, of course they weren't equipped for it because they weren't being recognized. They weren't being rewarded for thinking strategically. They were being rewarded for transacting business. Yeah. And ultimately then, and follow that, there was a 2020 or 2019 article I wrote, I can't remember the exact year, about Generation Next. And it was one of the most popular blog posts I've written on Procurement Insights. It had like 29, 30 comments within the first few hours it was posted. And I did a profile and interview with one of the Generation X people coming up, and what their background was. And they were educated, they had degrees, they chose procurement rather than fell into it, and so I look at it and say, well, wait a sec, why is there still a disconnect then? We seem to be getting far more interest and traction and interest in our profession. Why is there a talent war? And then I dug a little bit deeper. And, if I look at it, there are 2 seminal points for me that stood out. The first is that I did a series of surveys at a major conference. And I asked the question, if you had to choose all over again, would you choose procurement as a profession? And more than 50% said, no, we would not. Now, that may be surprising in and of itself, but what I noticed about that is an equal number of those who said they wouldn't were relatively new to the profession. I mean, we're not talking about somebody getting tired. We're not talking about what some in the industry will call dinosaurs. We're talking about people who chose the profession, got into it, were young, and after a year or two were saying, no, we want to do something different. And this leads into the second point, Kelly, where on average, and I mean, job turnover rates are much higher than they were when I first began all those years ago. In fact, probably back then, if you changed your job more than once, you're considered irresponsible and unreliable. Nowadays, we're changing jobs and having side gigs
Oh,
are
by the
no.
month.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But the average new hire actually leaves after 18 months. So you're wondering, why are they leaving? Like, where is the breakdown occurring? Is it really a people problem? Is it really just that alone that there isn't talent? And so the war for talent, when you think about it, is a misnomer because, the talent is there. The use of that talent, the alignment of that talent with performance measurements that actually have an impact, that's where I think a lot of the problem occurs. I don't think there's a lack of talent. I think there's a lack of alignment of objectives with capabilities.
And so that's really the myth that we're talking about, that any of the problems that exist around talent, which may all be real, but the myth is that the root cause of those challenges is a shortage of the right kind of capabilities among the people that are currently working in procurement. Is that it?
Or well, actually, even more so, the bigger issue, Kelly, is that procurement, the vision of procurement and what it does and its impact, and this before the pandemic, was always the same. It was a transactional, buy the best price you can mindset. It was very much a functional role. After the pandemic, we all learned that, somebody asked me, well, how would you describe supply chain? And, when I was looking at during the pandemic, I said, well, do you see that person getting groceries delivered? Do you see that person carrying the cell phone or the person pumping gas? I mean, that's supply chain at work. There isn't one part of our everyday life that supply chain and procurement doesn't touch. And the pandemic and the crises relating from that or coming out from that woke everybody up to just how important it is. So what I think happened there is that a lot of organizations, when they were looking at value purchasing and all this before the pandemic, when it hit, they were surprised because they weren't ready for it, because they hadn't done the proper setup and alignment of what they need in the way of talent. Number one. Number two, and I'm new talent is being taught all of these things in schools, in universities, etc. But what's happening is that they're starting in companies who revert back to the familiar during a crisis situation of, oh, well, we just got to preserve cash flow. We got to buy smarter. We got to get longer terms from suppliers. And that reversion is what's causing the frustration, the talent gap. People are leaving after 18 months. These are not because they're not equipped. They're not being motivated. They're not being engaged the way they had expected to, because procurement and supply chain is very dynamic. It is very exciting. And quite frankly, there isn't one part of our lives that doesn't happen without some point supply chain touching it. And that's the whole point. So the talent war is actually a misnomer because, realistically speaking, the skills are there in the up and coming generation, in the previous generation who's still performing. And I take the term dinosaur with a grain of salt because, number one, I'm old enough to be a dinosaur. Number two, and this is the key, is that a lot of those dinosaurs aren't dinosaurs by choice. Organizations, for example, with training and investing for the years leading up to the pandemic had been cutting back their budget on education. What's happened is there's no talent shortage. There's a shortage of vision within organizations as to what procurement and supply chain can do, and then realizing that vision, aligning it with the right people. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely, I do. And it's so funny because you can see the same sort of thing on the other side of the business. It would be like if sales, whether it's B2B or B2C, had this amazing program for new customer acquisition, but they had zero plan for customer retention. Yeah. So even within procurement, we looked and we said, okay, we have to try to inspire clever, hardworking, interesting new people from all different kinds of backgrounds to come and join our ranks and be in procurement. And then once we got them here, we're like, check, job is done. Whereas, and it's so interesting because in the past, you would reference the quote about sending people away, credit where credit is due. That's Charles Dominic.
Mhm.
He's another mutual friend from way back in the day. He actually compared procurement to the island of misfit toys from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It's
Right.
where you send employees when you never want to see them again. So we finally lured some cool kids to come join us in this place that we knew was awesome and interesting and great for your career. But once we got them to join us, it's almost like we didn't have a plan B. We didn't have a way to help the profession seem sticky and keep them once they had joined us.
Well, that's right. The mindset hadn't changed. I remember
Right.
speaking at so many webinars and conferences and talking about this and things like this, and people coming afterwards saying, I'm really motivated. I'm really pumped up. And then they'd say, but on Monday morning, I go back to the office and I got to deal with the same thinking
Yeah.
that I've been dealing with all along. That procurement isn't strategic. Procurement is again an adjunct of finance, or it's a function. And I oftentimes people ask, well, what should I do if I'm motivated, I'm buying in what you're saying. What should I do if my company doesn't? And they'd say, what should I do? I'd say, well, maybe you should look for another company to work with. Look for one who is innovative, because
Yeah.
supply chain is the new battleground. It is strategic. I mean, I think there's areas that we have to look at and say maybe we should have procurement departments be set up as profit centers. Some organizations, I interviewed a senior VP, they actually broke off the procurement team into a separate, almost like an outsourced company within it.
Yes.
Like it has its own balance sheet, own ledger, etc., to support their infrastructure, which was an infrastructure of distribution, warehouses, and franchises, etc. And I thought about it. I said, you see, now these people are working on a profit center standpoint. They understand the cost and the value and what it brings in. And I think that's really, we've got to start thinking of procurement in that light. It isn't just a function. And I think there's still too many companies that look at it and hire based upon that checkbox.
Now, do you have any advice? I mean, we certainly talked about this poor person that ends up in a place where procurement is not respected or valued, and you say, maybe now it's time to shop around for a new position. But if you're someone, especially someone with hiring responsibility in a procurement team, and you've either done a good job of bringing new talent into the group, or maybe you're starting to notice people departing that you would want to keep, what advice do you have within procurement to make sure everyone sees the potential of sticking around for what's next?
Well, I think what they have to do, it starts off is, and this is the key when looking for a job. I'm going to put some of the onus on the people who are looking to hire and those who are looking to be hired. How many people go into an interview and actually do research on the company for whom they're working or would like to work? How many of them ask the interviewer as many questions as the interviewer asks them? I think where it has to start is the tough questions have to start coming from the talent that's being interviewed. That you have to say, look, this is what I see, this is what I believe, etc. How does this line up with your view of procurement or supply chain? And then if it doesn't, having the courage to say, I'm going to keep looking. Because ultimately what will happen is, and I know the reality, people need jobs. You've got, obviously, you can't sit around waiting for the perfect opportunity. But I think there's not enough critiquing in terms of the companies that are looking to hire beyond the perfunctory. Well, here's our values, here's who we are, and we may be a known brand. There has to be something more there. And I think when you're looking for a job, when you're looking and you've invested in your procurement education, I think you have to scrutinize the organization that is interviewing you as much, if not more, than they are you.
And I think that's one of the things that more people should go into interviews prepared with. Yes, I want to be ready. I have good answers in my head. I'm prepared to explain what I've been doing for the last number of years so that I sound like an attractive candidate. But I do think that critical thought, what are my concerns or questions about this company? Those interviews really and truly should be two-way.
Absolutely. And one of the things I learned a long, long time ago, and as you know, Kelly, I mean, I built up a company, I sold it. I've been an executive with a publicly traded company, et cetera. And one of the things that I always respected is when somebody challenged me. And when I say challenge me, again, not to be contentious, but saying, well, why do you think that way? I had respect for that because, at the end of the day, you want to get it right versus being right. You want to get the right people in there. And maybe there are things that can change and get better. And you have to leave yourself open. So the hiring company, the hierarchy has to look at this and say, okay, who do we really want? Do we want people who are just going to, again, follow orders in the checkbox? High turnover. We're not getting our traction that we should. Or do we want people who are going to come in and actually make it better? And are we going to be comfortable with that? And I think that's really the whole key of that's the real war. The war exists not as a matter of talent, but between a potential candidate and the company looking to hire. Are you confronting each other in a positive manner that you get and understand that there's a fit of values in what you want to do? And that's the key.
Absolutely. Now, Jon, this is going to be interesting. And people that have listened to this podcast before know where we're going next. But I just want to remind everybody, I never know what answer somebody is going to give when I ask this next question. So here's the tradition, Jon. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you 2 questions. You can answer either one, and there is no such thing as a wrong answer. So let me give you the 2 questions. The first one is, what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? And the second is, in your opinion, what does heroism look like in a business context?
Wow, those are great questions. I hope there's some major appliances at the end as prizes. Anyway.
This is a podcast. This is not The Price is Right.
Okay, right. Okay, good. If you look at it, I'll start with the second question, the sourcing hero. I mean, the sourcing hero has to be somebody who challenges the norm. Again, not for the sake of challenging it, but because they think there's something better. They want to do something. And it's not easy. In many ways, I can remember early days of feeling like you're a lone voice in the woods and, no one's listening to you. And you're listening for that echo and it isn't coming back. And you go through those periods of that. But when you look at it, a sourcing hero is someone who is willing to get it right versus being right, is willing to stand up for what they know will get it right, even if it isn't popular. And I mean, those are old rules, what's always popular isn't right and what's right isn't always popular. But those are the intrinsic values. You have to be able to say, look, I believe that this is the way we should be going. I think what we're doing now isn't going to work. This is the way we should be going. It's not personal against anyone. And I think that's very important. It's not, we can have disagreement. We don't need people agreeing. We can have disagreement, but it can be respectful. But, we don't have to agree. We can sit there and say, look, this is why I think, without a personal attack, this is what I think we're doing is wrong and why we have to change. And then sticking to their guns and being able to just basically stand firm. That's a sourcing hero. That's a hero of any kind. So to me, that would be my definition of a sourcing hero. Now, the first question you asked, and what was that again? Just give it to me. I'm old and I seem to forget things.
The other one is, what does heroism look like in a business context?
And I think it just builds on that. Thanks, Kelly. I think heroism is, again, the ability to say what needs to be said. There's an old saying or the old story. Are you willing to say that the emperor has no clothes?
Oh, yes.
And that's really what it comes down to is you have to be able to call it like it is. Look, I'll digress a little bit on the side here. Going back in the early days, ERP software, the struggles procurement had with success in that. It was very limited success overall. And then the on-demand and SaaS model started to emerge. And one of the biggest obstacles that CPOs and executives had to overcome within their company was explaining why they had been spending millions of dollars on technology that wasn't delivering results when they could be dealing with these new SaaS pay on demands, by the drink, as some call them, solutions that could be up and running within weeks, some days, and delivering some value for a fraction of the price. Do you want to go up in front of your board and say, well, for the last 3 years, we've been spending this and it hasn't been panning out, but over here, we can now do this? How many people hesitated and looked at these new emerging solutions, the technologies that are now defining our industry, and looked at it and said, oh, well, they're bolt-on applications. I remember a report back in 2000 by the SIIA, Software Association, where they said the overarching ERP solutions and these customized solutions have a shelf life, and the emerging technology, the software as a service, and we knew about this going back to 2000, 2001, is going to be the model that's going to replace it. And so people were looking at it and they were saying, yeah, but what do we do with the investment we've made? So in that context, the real heroes there were the people who stepped out and said, look, we know this major multi-million dollars of investment isn't working. We're going to invest in this new software. Now, there's other problems here because software alone won't solve many of the issues. And that's a discussion, Kelly, for another interview. But the reality is they were courageous enough to say, this isn't working. We've spent a lot of money, but let's not throw good money after bad. Let's admit it and let's fix it.
And that does take courage. And that does take people willing to speak up. And hopefully some of the people listening in will feel inspired, not only by the examples that you've given, but by our exchange. Jon, if people are just meeting you today, I'm lucky to have known you forever, but if people are just meeting you today, what would you suggest is the best way for them to get in touch?
Well, there's two ways. And, it's interesting. If you enter in Google, procurement insights, because they've been around so long, I'm usually up in 2 or 3 places on the first page. Other than that, if you want to get into LinkedIn, Jon W. Hansen, I'm there. I'm in the conversations, and I'm always welcoming new people coming on board to engage in conversation. Just one caution I would give, Kelly, is expect to be tagged, because if you're following me for a reason, then I want value. And I'm going to tag you in these things. And I'm going to want your opinions heard. I want a dialogue, a community of dialogue. So that's the only warning I would give.
Well, everybody is fair warned then, but the discussions are always worth being a part of. Jon, thank you so much for being with me today to share your point of view.
Great. Let's not wait so long. We should do it again soon.
Agreed. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.